After Gwyn was ousted from power, and Gwendolyn took his place as king of the gods, the inhabitants of the world of man left their homeland. The souls amassed by the one who links the fire flourish anew, meaning they reincarnate. About half of them fuel the bonfire, the recreated first flame, advancing the natural cycle of the world, which was halted by Gwyn's undead curse, and half of them are emitted by the fire. So, an expedition to new land was needed to hunt for the souls that were flourishing anew because of the linking of the flame. This parallels the hunt for large souls that took place during the Age of Ancients. Men searched for stray embers buried in the ground like treasures.
Then, from the dark, they came and found the souls of lords within the flame. And the furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten.
The men who left a ruined Lordran would eventually discover an unexplored continent, a new world which they would call Heide, a name that means area of uncultivated land. This event mirrors our world's Age of Discovery, when the maritime expeditions by the Portuguese took place. In the case of Dark Souls, during each Age of Discovery, there were two expeditions, each conducted by one of the noble houses of the world of men, Thorland and Karim. The first one was led by Havel, a noble from the house of Thorland, which derived from Gwyn's lineage, and the second was led by Leydia, a noble from the house of Karim, which derived from Velka's lineage. Leydia's name comes from a biblical character, a wealthy businesswoman who sells purple cloth, a reference to Velka's purple miracles of divine retribution as well as to her noble origin, and who most notably becomes the first European to convert to Christianity, a particularly significant reference, since Firelinking is directly based on the Christian faith. Upon settling on Heide, this barren land, devoid of civilization, Havel founded a country and named it after him, which goes in line with the characterization of the members of Gwyn's clan as proud and blunt men. Havel means cockerel, a male chicken, the name being emblematic of the dawn, which, in the context of Dark Souls 1, refers to the dawn brought by Gwyn, and in the context of Dark Souls 2, to the new dawn that the discovery of Heide would call upon. Havel was, in times of old, deified as Old Man McLoyf, the god of drink and medicine, and he created the Estus flask. Nito was Gwyn's father-in-law, Velka's father. The Japanese language has three words for uncle, and the Japanese script of Dark Souls refers to Nito, implying the term that in this context means father-in-law. He was deified as Lloyd, and he invented the Undead Hunter charm, which used to be called Lloyd's talisman. This talisman serves as the inversion of the Estus flask, and was used to prevent the undead from healing. Havel was Velka's father-in-law, Gwyn's father, as evidenced by his name, which again refers to the calling of the dawn, to the birth of Gwyn, the Lord of Light, as well as by the descriptor of old men, which, in the context of the gods of Anorlondo, who were simply the deified members of royalty, denotes seniority over other such gods. Havel being deified with the name McLoyf, and having created the Estus flask, a medicinal drink, fitting to have been invented by the god of medicine and drink, serves to make him an inverse parallel to Nito. One ended up harming men to the benefit of the gods, the other ended up conspiring against the gods to the benefit of men. One is portrayed in gold, the color of the few, the other in copper, the color of the many. Nito helps to spread the curse of undead, going against his daughter's wishes, and Havel helps to undo the curse of undead, going against his son's wishes. Havel created the Estus flask by basing himself on his knowledge of the immortal ancient dragons, his enemies of old which he admired so much, who were now his allies. We find a miracle of Havel near the only surviving archdragon, after all. It is fitting that a man such as Havel would be the founding father, again, a reference to his patriarchal role as Gwyn's father, to a country that centers around the journey of undead. The pioneers, who landed on the southern shore, thoroughly explored the continent. They found a valley filled with a special mineral they would refine into an alloy that would be employed to create unusually durable equipment. Most notably, the weapons of the Hyde Knights, which natively deal lightning damage. When unalloyed, the metal that derives from the ore is as black as the ore itself, a reference to the primordial energy of nature that is black, a combination of all colors, of all elements. Within the valley rested the reincarnated soul of an old one, the soul of Gwyn, the Lord of Light, which is the reason behind the presence of the dark and dense minerals which resulted from the Icarus Earth. ichor being an ethereal fluid talked about in Greek myth, which flows through the veins of the gods, though it also refers to the foul-smelling, watery discharge that can be found in wounds or ulcers in classic From Software dualistic irony. The darkness of the ore is, indeed, emblematic of Gwyn's dualistic nature, and a reference to the dragons, Gwyn's enemies, who later inspired, due to his envy of them, his corruption into turning from Christ to Antichrist. And finally, it refers to the dichotomy between Gwyn's light exterior and his dark interior, for he was ultimately a man, and like any man, he was not immune to the temptation of the dark. In this context, the ichorous fluid is lava, and it used to flow abundantly through the valley. Indeed, near the valley was a vast range of volcanoes, which would expel their lava from their tops, a reference to Gwyn's empire at the upper realm. The lightning damage of the alloy that is made from the ichorous mineral is a reference to Gwyn's lightning miracles, which are stored within his soul's memory. Its impressive durability is a reference to Gwyn's desire to create an immortal empire which he would rule as an Antichrist-like figure. A city was erected near the valley. Its name would be Volgen, a name meaning to pursue, denoting ambition. Its architecture was inspired by an Orlando, for Havel hailed from there. The valley would be named Lanafir. In Japanese, Lao Canal, Lao meaning precious, beloved, darling, as well as garnet, ruby, and red, and Canal referring to the lava that used to flow through it. As the southwestern shore, they'd build a fortress that would serve both as a training ground for warriors and a way of defending that border against invaders. Enormous statues depicting fierce warriors were built to intimidate any foreign threat. At Heide's distant north, the pioneers met a miraculous sight, a nostalgic sea of stone pillars which housed dragons. That is, wyverns, their descendants, but nonetheless, it was a wonderful vision which inspired the king to build his castle there. Even more inspiring, however, was the dragon egg they found at its tallest peak. They built the castle alongside a shrine dedicated to dragon worship. The castle is the place that would later become known as Aldea's Manse, which is why it has been overtaken by moss and foliage when we reach it in the distant future. It was one of the first constructions built on Heide. The castle was adorned with sculptures of its king, Havel, a man wielding a sword and a scroll. The statue is directly based on the figure of Paul, the Christian apostle, who in turn is based on Saul, a warrior king who stood for priestly violence. In fact, both are Benjamites who are involved with human sacrifice, like Havel is involved with firelinking. Like Havel, who was, at first, a bishop of the Way of White, and killed Undead, the so-called agents of the dark, Paul kills the followers of Christ before his conversion to Christianity. Havel's epitaph, the Rock, has both the literal meaning and the symbolic of apostle. Havel was Gwyn's apostle, his right-hand man, when he was an archetypal Christ, who aspires to bring further gnosis to men. But after he became an Antichrist, Havel defected and became an adept of firelinking. Furthering this connection, Rome, the place where Christianity first arose, was an empire founded by Romulus and Remus, the twins who were raised by wolves. Gwyn's most upstanding knight, Artorias, is represented by a wolf and made a wolf his friend, and we find statues that portray him in the later built Church of Blue, though the statues don't resemble him, for they abided by the revisionistic religion of the New World. Similarly, there's a statue of Velka that presents travelers to three paths, one of which leads to Havel's castle. Flowers represent flame. The flowers around her feet represents the first flame, and she caresses a flower, a reference to firelinking. Velka represents Sophia, the eon that is analogous to the human soul, and who champions knowledge. She is opposite to Gwyn, who represents the demiurge, Satan, though, superficially, she was a dark witch, and she did make a deal with the devil, with the serpents. She is both Sophia and Lilith, a dark figure. Gwyn, her counterpart, is both Christ, as he brought the dawn to mankind, and Antichrist, as he became a prince of darkness. Both Velka and Gwyn are dualistic figures, and there is a clear yin-yang dichotomy between them. The undead who become true kings mirror the King of Kings himself, and Gwyndolin, Havel's master, the King of the Gods, represents the alchemical Rebis, the perfect human being, like Christ, and it's worth reiterating that his inversion is the Antichrist, which Gwyn, the previous King of the Gods, represented. But in yet another display of dualism, Gwyndolin is a master manipulator, like the father of lies, Satan. The sword he wields is a reference to his clan's culture of brave warriors, and the scroll is a reference to his status as a bishop. Most interestingly, however, is the symbol of the samsara, the wheel of life, that is amply featured on the walls of the castle. It is, of course, a blatant reference to the journey of the Undead, which ends in an allegory to attaining gnosis by linking the fire, breaking the wheel. The dragon shrine was built to host and to honor the dragon egg, which, not by accident, looks like a philosopher's stone. As explained in my previous video, the dragons represents the primal materia, that is, the raw energy of nature itself, which is why they are the fusion of every animal, the whole creature. They were originally everlasting statues, for they are designed as embodiments of the philosopher's stone. Havel would further his studies of the dragons, ever expanding his admiration and reverence for them. He creates the Dragon Remnant's Covenant, which mirrors the Dragon Covenant of Dark Souls 1. I must again reiterate that we find a miracle of Havel near the Ancient Dragon, the Master of the Covenant. To imitate the dragons is to attempt to rid yourself of your mortality, to seek everlasting life, which is a sensible reason for the myriad of undead to aspire to join the covenants in question. Touching the scales of an ancient dragon gives one a glimpse into the abyss, for the primordial dragon statues were everlasting because they weren't alive yet. They didn't have souls within them, and thus, before the advent of fire, were purely dark. Ironically, to transcend life through becoming like the dragons is to lose it entirely. That is also why the weapons derived from the remains of the dragons do not scale with any stats. They bear no life within them, only manifesting the raw. Like the infusion, which strips a weapon of its scaling and is represented by the image of a damp, dark hole, energy of nature. Those who aspire to become like the dragons would have to face a trial of might. The Drake Keepers, which were built with the dark mineral found in the Icaros Valley, serve as guards of the Dragon Shrine, and judges to those who want to conquer it and join the ranks of the Dragon Warriors. These automatons were inspired by the Iron Golem, a golem whose core was the remains of a dragon, and whose exterior was of black iron, black representing, as previously explained, the raw energy of nature, and whose duty was to judge the undead who wanted to conquer Sun's fortress. And as members of Havel's, that is, of Gwyn's clan, the Dragon Warriors respect the bravery and strength of worthy challengers, bowing to them as they pass their trials. Leydia, the leader of the second expedition, would land on the south of the continent as well. There, she built a fortress that would double as a school of magic inspired by Vinheim, the school gifted to Sif by Velka. The school would be named Melfia, which derives from the Greek word for honey being a symbol of enlightenment, as well as a reference to the matriarchal order of bee colonies. Hence the name Fia, which means wild and deer, an animal that represents innocence, and whose antlers represent resurrection. Her kingdom would be named Olafis, which is a name derived from Olaf that means descendants of the old, a reference to their ancestry. Olafis would revive the study of not only sorcery, but also of pyromancy, which was banned by Gwyn ever since the war against the demons. Its practitioners, royals of Karim, having been victims of a brutal witch hunt. In their exploration of the land, the scholars would find the bright stone cave and call it Tseldora, a combination of the world's jewel, as informed by the Japanese texts, and Dora, a name meaning gift. Within this cavern rests the reincarnated great soul of an old one, the soul of Sif, the pale drake, which is the reason behind the presence of the crystal-like, shiny minerals which bear concentrated souls within them. Surrounding the cave, a town of peasants, who would be employed as miners and farmers, was erected. The land used to be a barren wasteland, a desert, and so, commoners would be employed to create a vast underground system of artificial rivers to provide water for the denizens of the town, and fertilize the region's soil. The Brightstone would be employed to create the Staves of Wisdom, the best staves in the game, which feature an S-scaling with intelligence. The absurd capacity of the unprocessed crystal to draw power from intelligence is a reference to Sif's search for knowledge, and its capacity to cast hex sorceries, spells that conjure water, dark, and only a thin layer of light, alongside regular sorceries, spells that conjure water and light, as exemplified by the Sunset Staves and by the Staves of Amana, is a reference to the dark nature of the ancient dragons. A city was built near the desert. Its name would be Forossa, Foro meaning forum in Latin and Rossa meaning red. Its architecture derives from that of Izalith, the kingdom of the Witches of Chaos. Within its territory, we find the Old Sun Ring, a ring that references in its texts, design, name, and even function the chaotic, parasitic son of Izalith. Its description reads: an odd stone ring containing a fiery heat. Accumulates power as the user is harmed, then explodes, damaging surrounding enemies while leaving its wearer unscathed. Our deeds will come back to us in some form or another, both good and bad. The ring's function is emblematic of the explosion, or rather, of the eruption triggered by the self-immolating ritual the witch performs to give birth to the bed of chaos. Izalith means, as explained in the previous episode, land of stonemakers. It was within this forest that the reincarnated soul of an old one, of the witch of Izalith, was buried, which is the explanation behind the desertification of the land. The Great Soul manifests as the witch's thirst for power, acting like a demiurge, a parasite, sucking the life from the earth and its inhabitants and shrouding it in fog. A reference to the configuration of the world when flame first appeared at the earth's bosom, with water resting above, dissipated as fog. The result of a body from which the soul has been wholly extracted is petrification. The Great Soul residing below the earth, within the underworld, is also a reference to the empire of the witch, who wanted to recreate the first flame through sinful means. I will now analyze in depth the designs of the king and queen, of Havel and Leydia, which were delicately crafted and feature incredible detail. Havel has an immense beard, reflecting his deific title of Old Man. His sword also vaguely looks like an old man's cane, which is not only a symbol of old age and wisdom, but also of strength and resilience. His helmet looks like the hat of a pope, which relates to his previous title of Bishop of the Way of White, and further ties him to Gwyndolin, who's a pope himself. The waist piece of his armor features dragon scales, like the armor of his grandson Flann. His armor's color scheme represents the sunset, yet another symbol of old age, as well as a symbol for the ending of Gwyn's day, for the sequel to his Age of Fire. Around his neck is a mantle of crow feathers, denoting his affiliation to Velka and the Firelink conspiracy. Adorning his shield is a sword-like pattern that pierces a flower and an empty circle, the sun, whose rays can be seen shining below it, in a reference to the Firelink conspiracy. And as a final observation, his sword's pommel is a reference to his old helmet, to the cockerel's crest, which his loyal knights of old still wore in Heide. Leydia's mask is shaped like a crow beak and made from gold, an obvious reference to the mask of Velka, which was still used by her loyal followers of old in Heide. Atop her helmet is a pair of dragon wings, a reference to Velka's allegiance to the dragon's cause, though they also vaguely look like a deer's antlers. Her white cape is identical to that of Gwyndolin, a symbol of femininity, as well as a symbol of the four wings of the dragons, and of the butterflies, which are animals emblematic of moonlight. Adorning her neck covering is the leaf of the Way of Blue. The handle of her sword references the coiled swords of the bonfires, which are tools for the undead and instruments of firelinking created by Velka, who sacrificed herself to fuel the first bonfire with her ashes. Her small shield portrays the face of a suffering undead, a reference to Kaita, the goddess of tears, the new name Velka is known for in Heide, which is more closely associated with her nurturing facet, thus dimensioned by the tearstone rings, which represents the tears she shed for the accursed. The shield is also a chime, a reference to both the bells of awakening, which are integral to the undead prophecy, as well as to the bells that call undead from their graves to link the fire. Her chest piece is also vaguely shaped like a bell. Behind the capes, the skirt, and the armor are dark clothing. The color scheme of her set is representative of the moon, of its light, and of the night. The two countries became close allies to each other, hence their leaders, Havel and Leydia, would marry to cement their political alliance, much like Gwyn and Velka married to each other to cement theirs. Heide was a continent united under one banner and under one objective, that being to link the fire. The symbol adopted by the alliance portrays their ambition. Two imposing dragons stand before a flower that is pierced by a sword. The two dragons are a reference to Kav and Framt. The Firelink conspiracy operates through an alliance between man and dragon, which seeks to restore the natural cycle of the world and undo the curse that was cast upon it. They share a mutual interest, for man wants to get rid of the curse of undead, and the dragons want to empower themselves, which they can't do if the world is stagnant. The image of the two dragons is an evolution of the symbol of the two serpents, They're transformed, whole selves, which is more directly based on Kaf and Frampt, who represents duality but serve the same goal, just like Havel and Leydia. As previously explained, the sword that pierces the flower is a reference to the Firelink conspiracy. After all, the sun is symbolically pierced by the coiled sword, which extracts its fire to fuel the recreated first flame. The two dragons are linked to Leydia, and the sword that pierces the flower is to Havel. Thus, the crest of Heide means the establishment of a new world, guided by firelinking under the union of opposites. It esoterically references the alchemical magnum opus as the macrocosm, the Rebis, which is the male and the female conjoined into one being that is empowered by the dragon. The king and queen built a castle, which would serve to host the throne of the King of Kings, of the one who will link the fire, of the one who will become a true king through martyrdom, like Jesus Christ. The path to the throne is a straight line, adorned with giant candles that illuminates the deep, dark abyss surrounding it, a reference to occult knowledge and to the first flame. And the throne itself is like a kiln of ash, for the king who sits on it will burn and become the supreme martyr, the truest of kings. It is the new world's kiln of the first flame, the flame that rests below the surface of the world and that opposes the sun, though the throne would be a later development. At this point in the timeline, only the castle was built. The castle would serve as a final test to the Firelinkers, a trial of mice that filters those with souls and fits to fuel the recreated first flame. Firelinking in itself is a reference to achieving gnosis. Souls are composed primarily of light, and thus, the one with a supreme soul, a soul fits to link the fire, achieves enlightenment. The soul memory mechanic is directly based on this. After all, memories are themselves souls. Only an undead with a high enough soul memory can open the gates to this climactic test, which, superficially, in the realm of the material, also serves as an assessment of strength. The place that hosts the gates is called Shrine of Winter, for firelinking aims to advance the cycle, putting an end to Gwyn's summer, which means the coming of fall, as symbolized by the Way of Blue's falling leaves, and later of winter. The king and queen would both sit on a throne to rule over the continent from this castle. The dominant religion of their empire was the Way of Blue, a subversion of the Way of White. The Way of White was the religion founded by Gwyn to spread the curse of undead. Its maidens would revive the deceased, producing undead, and its paladins would conduct undead hunts which would spread the plague of undeath. The Way of White means the way towards a new dawn. The religion was created by Gwyn in response to the endless night that threatened his rule. The Way of Blue, in contrast, is a religion that aims to undo the curse, and so its paladins, the Blue Sentinels, act as protectors to journeying undead. The Way of Blue is, in fact, more akin to a humble prayer spread amongst those who seek help in their firelinking odysseys. It's not a coincidence that upon reaching the final rank of the Way of Blue, the undead is awarded with a blue tearstone ring, a ring created by Velka, whose nurturing facet is now called Kaita, the goddess of tears, which symbolizes the tears she sheds for the cursed, and that protects those closest to death. The Way of Blue means the way toward a new night. The religion was created by Gwyndolin, the inheritor of Velka's will, and Gwyn's successor as king of the gods, in response to the endless day that was caused by the curse. That is made even more blatant by Dark Souls 3's iteration of the Covenant, whose symbol is a blue waxing crescent moon. In Dark Souls 2's case, its symbol is a leaf, a reference to the fall which firelinking will bring as Gwyn's summer fades. The Blue Sentinels are a continuation of Gwyndolin's Order of Knights, the Knights of the Dark Moon. They punish the guilty in accordance with Velka's law and protect the beneficiaries of the Accord of the Way of Blue. As opposed to the Way of White, a religion that hunted the meekest among men, the Way of Blue protects them. The Blue Sentinels would also have power over commerce, as a means of ensuring that bad actors wouldn't prosper and harm their cause. Before the expeditions had been initiated, an accord was made by both leaders with the King of the Gods, Gwyndolin. They would forbid the uttering of the names of the old gods in the New World they were set to discover. This measure was taken to facilitate the subversion of the faith of the undead. The religion of Heide would worship new gods, though all of them were based on figures from Lordran. Gwyndolin also instructs them to proliferate the new faith of the Way of Blue, and ordain many of the pioneers, his Blue Sentinels. Havel, the king, orders the construction of the Heide's Tower of Flame alongside the Church of Blue. The Tower of Flame served as the lighthouse that directed undead from foreign lands to Heide. They'd orient their ships to follow its light, which shone brightly on the ice that surrounded the continent. As they reached Heide through an underground port and left its underworlds to get to the surface, they'd miss the sunset, with the tower losing its contrast with its surroundings. The area around the Tower of Flame deliberately parallels Anorlondo in its configuration. We must defeat waves of golems who act as guards and reach the cathedral, the Church of Blue, that hosts the last trial, a silver clone of Dragonslayer Arnstein that conjures the dark, a reference to that which the contender for the throne must face, who must be defeated by the bearer of the curse. Aspiring blue sentinels has to undergo this microcosmic reenactment of the journey of the chosen undead to join the ranks of the Order. Statues of Gwyn, with his head replaced by that of a falcon, a symbol of the sun, and a reference to the sun god Ra of Egyptian mythology, were sculpted to adorn this trial of strength in reference to the ancient customs that derive from Gwyn's clan of warriors. Gwyn's clan espoused a warrior culture among its members. Its leaders were chosen by their strength. Gwyn was a warrior king who fought against the dragons on the front lines. Havel, the founding father of the country named after him, kept the tradition of his culture alive. Havel would order the excavation of an underground graveyard to host the remains of the challengers who failed their quests. They'd be sanctified through death, for they gave their lives to the cause of firelinking. Thus, the cemetery would earn the name Grave of Saints. To avoid the spread of the curse, Havel would make an accord with the Rat King who lived below. The men would rule over the surface, and the rats would be allowed to rule the underworld. This made it so the dead would have their souls petrified and then eaten by the rats, whose bite inflicts petrification, preventing accursed sparks of souls from drifting to the overworld and contaminating men. The statues of rats holding pots are in reference to their role as those who contain the curse. The foreigners who wished to undergo the trials and become true kings by linking the fire would settle near the southern coast and build a small village, Majula, its name meaning to progress. A monument would be built in the honor of the countless deaths of brave undead, a monument that looks like the Christian cross and like the coiled sword of the bonfires. Near the monument was a stone engraved with a covenant, a reference to the biblical commandments, which were engraved on stone. This covenant, the Company of Champions, would transpose the souls it received from its members in the form of all stones to their worlds, making their journeys more difficult, with the purpose of enriching their souls, for suffering sanctifies the Christian man. The champion epitaph is a metaphor for apostle, like the name Peter, which means stone, like the stone that hosts the covenant. Leydia, the queen, orders the construction of the Shrine of Amana, alongside the Undead Crypt. The Shrine of Amana is the place that would serve to beckon those close to dying to find their deathbeds. For this purpose, the scholars created the Fenitos, female homunculi, who share a lack of individuality, their only function being to sing a beautiful lullaby to both attract and soothe the departing, alongside the bright bugs, which in turn serve that same function. They'd be made to wear rings of the dead to hide their corpse-like appearances as to make them look pleasing to the undead they served. Their song would also serve to soothe the deformed creature that lied dormant in the caves, a being referred to as a demon, though not one born out of the bed of chaos, but of the organic remains of deceased dragons, destroyed archtrees, and dead men who fought against the dragons thousands of years before, when they ruled as one sole continent, like the sanctuary guardian of Forossa. Upon waking up, the creature develops the habit of eating men, for it felt incomplete, like every other greedy descendant of the ancient dragons. The creature is shaped like a frog, as the other aquatic-like or amphibian-like life forms birthed by the remains of the dragons, for they are related to water and dark, as they hail from an age before fire and light had appeared. Its exoskeleton is nearly impervious to damage, as it derives from a mixture of the stone scales of the dragons with the stone wood of the archtrees. Its interior, however, betrays its human part. It took the shape of a frail hollow, of a frowning dead man with large hands that know only to hunt and grab its feed. Its primitive, instinct-based nature is reflected by its design, which references the sensory homunculus, a visual representation of how man's basic senses perceive his own being. The Undead Crypt would serve as the resting place for all, and it doubled as a mechanism for enforcing the rule of firelinking. The effigies made for the dead were connected to bells that would toll to awake the slumbering man when needed. It's worth noting that souls are also associated with sound, Bells and chimes are particularly powerful tools of soul resonation. A strong enough bell is even capable of summoning a soul from afar. An identical mechanism would be employed in the distant future for the same purpose. The crypt is replete with imagery that depicts Velka as a motherly figure to the dead, not unlike what her father, Nito, used to be. He was the Allfather of the dead. There is also a statue with a candle attached to her head. Again, candles are a symbol of occult knowledge. The statue can be lit to grant light to the crypt in reference to gnosis. The Fenito, the male counterparts to the male Fenito, were homunculi made from the dead created to serve as guards of the crypt. They were instructed to attack under the smallest hint of light, as to avoid disturbing the dead. Only with a queen's decree would one be allowed to operate the crypt. The great sword wielded by Agdain, the leader of the Fenito, his name deriving from Abdullah, which means servant of God, features a dark sun as its pommel. A creation myth was invented to orient the pale homunculi about their purpose. They were, as the story goes, made by Nito, though his name is absent from the story, for uttering the names of the old gods of Lordran is forbidden. To weave death and watch over the dead, in the case of the Fenitos, and to sing the appeasing song, in the case of the Mil Fenitos. They were also told of Kaf's version of the events that preceded the first game, and believe it to be the truth. The makers of the homunculi servants of the crypt, the Leydia witches and apostles, would reside there, taking care of the place and of the dead within it. Those two construction projects inversely mirror each other, with one serving as a trial of combat to the undead, and the other serving as their tranquil resting place. One implies Gwyn as its guardian deity, the warrior king who watches over the challengers as they prove their valor, and the other implies Velka, the witch who watches over the dead as they rest in peace. The two kingdoms, Havel and Olafis, made a joint effort to produce a rebis. Havel had a culture of golem making, and Olafis a homunculi making one. They'd combine their knowledge to create a magnum opus. For that aim, they'd conduct experiments on humans. Again, like those Sif had performed to create Gwyndolin, which produced grotesque creatures. The first experiment resulted in the birth of the beings who would later be known as flexile sentries, the conjoined lizard men. The second experiment resulted in a two-headed spider, whose exoskeleton became as hard as a rock. Tark, a warrior from Havel, whose name ironically means smart, wise, and knowledgeable. And Najka, a sorceress from Olafis, whose ironic name is a combination of Naj, meaning elegance or gracefulness, with Jika, which means if or when, as in a conditional statement, as well as to change, to transform. Used to be a pair of lovers who desires to become one being, and so volunteer to become the Rebis, the union of male and female empowered by the dragon. Both were transformed into chimeric beings, not unlike the chaotic demons of old. For the dragons represents the primordial chaos, and the demons are their artificial imitations. This is why their designs mirror those of Islif's Spider-Woman. They failed to become the Rebis, and would tragically turn on each other in the future. A subtle allusion to Gwyn and Velka's marriage, as Tark is a warrior and Najka is a sorceress. They sentenced themselves to eternal damnation, as one can't harm the other, for their souls were linked in the ritual. Finally, the extensive research of the alchemists bore fruit. An angelic being, which combined both masculine and feminine features, and was empowered by the dragons, was created. His design features a hood very similar to those worn by the Leydians who created and managed the Undead Crypt, and his skin is blue like that of a Fenito, denoting he, much like them, was made from the dead. His nails are black, further indicating this origin. He has angel-like wings, as well as a flowing bluish skirt. Both features are references to Sif, the Pale Drake. It's possible the essence of the dragons was taken from both the petrified egg of Havel and from the bright stone of Olafis, which hosted Sif's very soul within it. Furthermore, his organic-looking dress is made from bluish-white scales that look like feathers, or perhaps vice versa. He has 4 arms, which symbolize divinity in Hindu and Buddhist iconography. 4 arms are a symbol of the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 corners of the universe, a subtle callback to the 4 kings, which used to rule over Astora, the Middle-earth of Lordran, the first kingdom to be afflicted by the Undead curse, and the first to succumb to the temptation of the Abyss. His cloning ability is a further connection to the Abyssal Kings, as well as the name he would be called in the future, Darklurker. He is capable of summoning a portal to cast spells from that looks like the Eclipse, and like the dark sign, as both are mirrors to each other in the macro and microcosm. He can conjure the 4 elements with his magic, like Gwyndolin, for both are the Ribis, the perfect alchemical creations. In fact, his teleporting magic is a reference to his predecessors. And finally, the middle section of his skirt looks like a uterus, which is yet another side to Gwyndolin, whose skirt's middle section represents menstruation, as informed by the developers in an interview. The alchemical magnum opus was tasked with a duty from his inception. He would sacrifice himself in a ritual to produce a Firelink in Kiln in the New World, like Velka has done in Lordran. Both the king and the queen would escort him to the chamber, where the ritual would be performed, and the couple would abdicate their own thrones to forever watch over and defend the throne of Ash, waiting for a successor to challenge them and prove himself worthy of becoming a true king. They'd face the contenders to the throne as a pair, each protecting and healing the other in a dance fitting for two lovers. The end of Havel and all of this was both imminent and inevitable. As nature itself is cyclical, so is man's world. With both king and queen absent, insurrections ensued. Without the pair of wise rulers in power, mankind fell to propaganda and superstition. What followed was the first war of the New World, the war that would bring instability and destruction to Heide's civilization. The names Havel, Olafis, and Heide would soon be lost. And this is the end of the first chapter of the complete lore guides to Dark Souls 2. I sincerely thank you for watching. I have decided to split the second part of the complete lore guides to Dark Souls in chapters, which will eventually be united under one upload with a revised script and additional information, as to not overload my computer during editing. The complete Dark Souls 2 video will be about 3 hours long, and my setup can barely handle a 1 hour and a half long video. That, and to avoid leaving my viewers waiting for too long. After I'm done with the second and third episodes, I will also merge them into one gigantic video, alongside the first episode, with a revised script and additional information as well.